Okay, so if anybody wants to jump in, you can jump in. But in any case, we'll begin with Maimonides, and then if we have time, then we'll also go to the Talmud to get some background. So Maimonides says like this. What Maimonides says is that, yes, if you hire someone to work, okay, it could start either way. No, if you hire someone to guard your produce, he's not an employee. In other words, he's not a worker. He's not working in the produce. He can't eat the produce because the only person that can eat the produce is the person working with the produce. However, that's the biblical law. However, the custom has become that someone who's hired to guard the produce should be allowed to eat. So now you have to allow the guard to eat because of the practice, not because of the law. So if I ask you the question, should he be able to eat? Well, the answer is, well, yes, but yes, he can eat because the rabbis thought it was a good idea. It's a disagreement whether it's the rabbis. Most people think it's the custom. This became the custom. People thought you hired a guard. The employees can eat. A guard should also be able to eat. But nevertheless, Maimonides rules that biblically speaking, the Torah is not referring to someone who's coming to watch. The idea is if you're hands-on, if you're actually touching the grape, you should be able to eat some grapes. If you're the guard, no. If you're the truck driver, no. Nevertheless, the custom is that the guard should be able to eat. That's what we're going to look. We'll share the screen. We'll look at, what are we going to look at over here? We will look at chapter 12 of the laws of Schirut, the laws of employee, and number 9, watchmen for vats, grain heaps, and any produce that has been separated from the ground, for which the work that obligates tithing has not been completed. That's all the criteria that we're trying to meet from last week. Because remember last week we said once the job is complete for Meiser, once the tithing has been given, then you can't eat anymore. So we'll leave that alone for right now. But in other words, the point is the watchman, right? So you have a watchman here. So what is the law? Says Maimonides, may partake of the produce because of local convention. Local convention means local practice. Hebrew mehilchot medina, the laws of the land. Just became the practice that the watchman can eat. They are not granted this privilege according to scriptural law, because a watchman is not considered to be one who performs an action. Because a watchman is not considered to be one who performs an action, right? So the definition, at least according to Maimonides, we'll see in the Talmud, there may be different opinions, but this is no different opinions. We'll get to the next clause, will be different opinions. So what's happening here is you're a watchman, you're not working with the produce. And the principle is if you're working with the produce, you should be able to partake from the produce. If you're not working with the produce, the biblical law says there's no obligation, there's no permission for the employee to eat. In other words, without permission of the employer. And then, so that's the first point. Fine. Now it gets funny because there'll be a half a page in Talmud on this. What is the definition of working? Okay, so I know biblically speaking, I have to work, something physical. What does physical mean? Do I need to get my hands involved? What about my feet? What about my shoulder? Okay, we're law, so it has to be definitions. We need a definition. So let's see the definitions. If, however, a person works with his limbs, whether his hands, his feet, or even with his shoulders, he is entitled to partake of produce according to the Torah. Right? Because you'll see later, there's other ways of working. In those days, my kid, I walked into my child's classroom and they were watching a video of how they produce wine. And they saw people literally stepping on the grapes to squeeze it. And they thought it was so strange, but you'll see later, we're going to read about it later in this chapter. So in other words, here I'm working. I'm not touching the grape with my fingers, but I'm touching the grape with my toes. I'm sorry for ruining your morning. But then the question becomes, am I allowed to drink some of the grapes, some of the wine, or eat some of the grapes? Well, there's a debate. Maimonides says any limb is okay. You're doing work with any limb, or you're carrying, right? If you're carrying on a pole, you're carrying it with your shoulder, it's okay. Now, if you want, we could look in the Talmud and see it's not so simple. There's a whole Talmudic discussion with proofs back and forth to figure out whether I have to do work with only my hands or all my limbs, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe if we're interested, we can go back, look at that disagreement. But you know what? We'll learn one more maybe, and then we'll look at the Talmud of both of these. Okay, it's interesting. It's interesting not because on one hand you say it's so technical. On the other hand, you have to make a definition. You have to draw the line. What is the definition of working? What is the definition of I am doing labor, right? So you could think of it as the Torah says when you come to your friend's field or to his vineyard, then you can eat. The assumption is you're coming to work. Okay, what does work mean? I'm the bookkeeper. Okay, what's the bookkeeper? Are you actually eating? Are you actually eating the grapes? Are you touching the grapes? Do you have permission to eat the grapes? So that's the discussion. And we have to draw the line. And like I said, the second clause of this law was even more interesting. What is the definition of work? Do I need hands? You'll see later some people say you need hands and feet. It gets exciting. It gets very technical. But again, that's the law. Law is you have to draw the line. What exactly is considered work in the produce that will allow you to eat and partake? And you'll see that even if the owner doesn't want you to eat, it's too bad. If you hire me to take care of your produce, I'm allowed to eat. It's not considered theft. Otherwise, if it's the case where I'm not allowed to eat and I eat, it is considered theft. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Vicky. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I was just wondering if any smell has anything to do with it, but you can smell it.
If you hire me to be to taste the wine, right? So I'm a perfume. It's a big thing. A wine taster, and you have to have smell. That was the big thing with COVID. People were afraid that they're going to lose the taste, sense of smell. They're going to lose their livelihood. For these people who smell, they get paid for their smell. That's interesting. It's abstract. It seems like if anything, it would not be biblical. The permission would not be, unless you're touching it. If you're touching it, you have to touch it. If you don't touch it, if you don't have to touch it for the process, then I would say it's not biblical. Maybe it's the practice. Maybe it should be the practice, but it wouldn't be biblical. So far, you got to be hands-on. You're an employee, you're touching the produce. You can't say, oh, spend your whole day touching grapes and not eating grapes. It's cruel. It's almost cruel. I mean, it's almost cruel. Now you're going to argue that smelling would be the same thing. Could be. But again, I think if you're drawing the line, you would have to draw the line and say, no, not biblically. Maybe the Hilchot Medina, maybe the law of the land, maybe the custom should be that way, similar to I think smelling is actually, you're closer to the produce than the watchman, right? So I would say that you should be able to allow, but only by the custom, not by biblical law. A biblical law.
Yeah. Maybe this is just goes by default, because if you close enough, you can still smell it. Because if you can touch it, you can smell it. If you can touch it with, right? But by default,
I'm smelling but not touching. I wasn't hired to touch. I wasn't required I wasn't hired to do anything that requires labor, physical contact. I was hired to do something with smell. Let's say, I don't know, I'm in the perfume business. Okay, also it depends what business you're in, because it's something that grows from the ground. So maybe perfume, yeah, depending how they get it. Okay, it's complicated, but let's say wine, you hire me to smell the wine. Okay, so then I would argue that it's not biblically mandated, but perhaps it would be permitted because of the law, the custom of the land. In other words, the custom, the practice that developed. Because biblically speaking, you have to draw the line, and it seems that a line is physical contact. If you touch it, you can eat it. If you're hired to touch it, you can eat it. Yeah. Okay, now we get to another whole discussion. So you invited me to your field to harvest the field. Now when I go, let me tell you what happens when I go apple picking. I go apple picking. We go at least once a year, maybe more. And you come, and then they tell you, you can pick from these apples. And the first thing I say, what about those? Those are nicer. Say, no, those you can't pick from, right? That's for either tomorrow or for whatever. So you invite me to your field and you say, your job today is to harvest these apples. And I say, it's a wonderful field, wonderful orchard. There's the grapes over here, but I'm in the mood for a fig. And there's a fig tree right there. Am I allowed to eat your fig? Or if you hire me and say, your job is to harvest this line of grapes, Those grapes are nicer, they're tastier. Can I go and eat from the other grape, not the grape that I'm working on? In other words, do I get a pass to eat anything I want in this orchard, or is it specifically limited to the grape that I am to the fruit that I am working on? Again, this is typical Talmud. The Torah says you come to the person's field, you should your employee, you're coming to work, you should be allowed to you're allowed to eat of the grain, eat of the grain or the grapes. Those are the two examples that we read last week. They're just examples. So what does the Talmud say? Okay, so define, give me some parameters, right? So what does work mean? If I'm the watching, that was number 9. That was section 9. That was section 10. What does it mean I could eat in the field? What does the field mean? Just the tree I'm working on? Or can I eat something better? I like the other one better. And that's going to be number 10. And if you look at the Talmud, there's a whole full page discussion trying to figure out what to do. And you know what? There's no resolution. So Maimonides errs on the side of caution. Okay, so we'll get through that. Let's see if we can get through this. Okay, I think I'm at number 10 here. So we're starting from the end, so you're going to get the spoiler alert, but hopefully we'll go to the Talmud and you'll also see that it's a debate. It's not a simple matter. A worker who is working with figs may not partake of grapes. In other words, whatever the guy hired you to do, you invite someone to you hire someone, you bring him to your orchard or to your field and say to your whatever they call it, orchard, and you say your job is to harvest the grapes. I'm not allowed I can eat grapes, but I can't eat figs. Where does it say I can eat figs? How do I know? These laws are derived from Deuteronomy 23, which states when you enter the vineyard of your colleague, you may eat grapes. Why do you have to say you may eat grapes? Say when you enter the vineyard of your colleague, you may eat. It says, you may eat grapes, which means if you're invited into the vineyard, which vineyard is vine, is grape, you can eat the grapes, but you can't eat the figs. Okay. When a person is working with one vine, he may not eat from another vine, nor may he partake of grapes together with other food. In other words, what's the issue here? So I'm working on one vine, but I like the grape on the other vine. He says, no, you can only eat from what you're working on. Now, what about grapes? How many grapes can you eat alone? Not that many. But if you put it into a fruit salad, you can eat much more. Or you put it onto salt. You put in salt. Those days they would have no sugar. You put on salt. You can eat much more. So he says, no playing games. You can eat grapes, plain grapes, no changing them. So that's what he says here. He should not partake of them together. Okay, nor may he partake of grapes together with other food. He should not partake of them together with bread or salt.
I was running through yesterday with what's happening.
Okay, if, however, the worker set a limit concerning the quantity that he may eat, he may eat the produce with salt, with bread, or with any other food that he desires. In other words, the employee goes to the owner and he says, look, I'm allowed to eat and as many grapes as I want, right? Okay, how about I eat a half a pound of grapes and we'll settle that I'm only going to eat a half a pound. He says, yes, then you can go eat it any way you want. This gets even more technical. This is great. It is forbidden for a worker to suck the juice from grapes. Right? What am I doing? I want more grape. I don't like the grape, the fiber or whatever, the peel. So I'll take the grapes, I'll squeeze out the juice, drink the juice, and throw out the peel, throw out the rest of the body of the fruit. The problem is, if you let the guy do that, he's going to destroy many more grapes because he's not going to get full because he's only getting the good stuff. He's not eating the fiber. So you can't do that. You want a grape? No problem. Eat a full grape. No eating half grapes here. Again, it's not so important for his health that he should also eat the fiber and get all the minerals. But the point here is we're concerned the guy's going to eat too much. You have to fill up on the entire fruit. You can't just squeeze out the good parts. Reminds me of the people who come, and when it comes to, they come to the cake, they just want the frosting. So no, you can eat the frosting, you eat the cake. Okay, so that's what it sounds like to me. Okay, in any case, for the verse states, and you shall eat grapes. Doesn't say you could eat the juice of grapes. You could eat grapes. Neither the worker, this is funny, neither the worker's sons nor his wife may roast the kernels of grain in a fire for him. I'm coming to work in your field. And it's produce, so it's wheat. So I'm allowed to eat the kernels. Kernels doesn't taste so good. But if you roast them in the fire, it's even better. So you know what I'm going to do? while I'm working, I'll take a kernel, hand it to my wife, say, do me a favor, we're doing lunch. Why don't you barbecue this kernel and bring it back to me and I'll eat it. Can't do that. Again, you could eat the grain plain. There's no making here a whole feast. For this is implied by the above verse, which states, you may eat grapes as your desire. What does it mean? The implication is that you must desire the grapes as they are. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. So that is number 10. I think we'll do 11 also, which is interesting, and then we'll go to the Talmud. It is forbidden for a worker to eat an inordinate amount of the produce with which he is working. I don't know what in English. In Hebrew, it's achila gasa. You can't stuff yourself. You can't eat till you're too full. Why not? This is implied by the above verse, which states, "You may eat as you desire." Savecha. They translate "you desire," but really means you're satisfied. Eat grapes until you're satisfied, but don't eat grapes until you're stuffed. That's eating too many grapes. You may, as you desire to your satisfaction. It is permitted, however, for him to delay eating until he reaches the place of higher quality grapes and eat there. So you're going to work in the field the whole day. You're very smart. You know that in the morning, you are working with the grapes that aren't that delicious. The problem is if you fill up on these grapes that are not so delicious, by the time you come to the good grapes, you're going to be full. You're going to be sick and tired of grapes. So what the Maimonides says you can do, this is legitimate. You could wait. Don't eat. Manage your appetite. Don't eat the grapes that are not so good. Wait till you get to the good grapes and then eat the good grapes while you're eating. That's kosher. That's no problem. We continue. This is good information. If you're ever going to work as harvesting grapes and you need to know what you can eat, this is good information. Okay. A worker may eat even a dinar's worth of cucumbers or dates, even though he was hired to work only for a silver ma'ah, which is a small portion of that. In other words, let's say you're working with expensive fruit. In those days, the dates were luxury. So you come and you say you're hiring, maybe you're going to pay me $10 for the day. You can eat $20 worth of figs. It's no problem. There's no barrier. Torah says you can eat. You can't stuff yourself. But if you're eating expensive fruit, even if it's worth more than the guy is paying you, so at the end of the day, the owner, the employer is losing money because he's paying you for your work, but he's losing money because you're eating your fruit you're eating are too expensive. Nevertheless, that's allowed. Why is it allowed? It's allowed because the Torah doesn't set a limit of what you can eat. Nevertheless, Maimonides says we give him good advice and say don't do it because no one's going to hire you. Right? So you're allowed to, the employee is allowed to eat whatever he wants. Doesn't mean just because you're allowed to, it doesn't mean it's a good idea. That's what he's saying. A worker may eat even a dinar's worth of cucumbers or dates, even though he was hired to work only for a silver ma'ah. I don't remember the exact amount, but it's much less. Nevertheless, we teach a person not to be a glutton so that he will not close the doors in his own face. In other words, if I get the reputation that I'm the guy that shows up and eats more fruit, worth more than the value I bring to the employer, no one's going to hire me. I am literally closing the door in my own face. If a person is guarding 4 or 5 grain heaps, he should not eat his fill from only one of them. Instead, he should eat an equal amount from each one. Now he's saying another point. Another point is, if you're going to take a little bit, don't take all the produce from one place. It doesn't look good. It looks like you're causing a damage to that heap. What you want to do is you want to spread thin. Again, this is talking about someone who's guarding. So that you're guarding the heap of fruit. I'm going to eat all the heap of fruit in one corner. It doesn't look good for the owner. It doesn't look good that now this heap seems diminished. So the advice is, again, a guard is allowed to eat not by biblical law but by the custom. So the advice is to spread it out evenly. And spread the damage evenly. It doesn't seem as severe on the employer. So that's the story in short. And now Now we can go into the phone. It probably could take us a few hours to figure out what Maimonides now organized so beautifully. Many of these points are up for debate and are not so clear. And the rabbis love to find things to debate and discuss. And we'll get a little taste of that today. But in the meantime, that's the story in short. These are the laws we want. These are the parameters of our discussion. And then we're going to go into the Talmud. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to kind of think about what is the lesson for us, because we're not all here like in the business of harvesting grapes. Some of us may be like cooking, and it also goes back to being in close proximity. And also, like mystically speaking, there is some energy in the food. So if you're cruel to the person harvesting it or even cooking it, that negative energy can be absorbed. So I just was wondering what was
what's the takeaway for us in the modern world. So the point here is the modern application would be, if you have to go to the spirit of the law. The law is very defined, but the spirit of the law we read last week from the book of Chinuch, book of education, which says the Torah wants to cultivate compassion. So if you're going to hire someone, let's say you're at a very expensive restaurant, and you're going to hire someone to serve the food, but you're going to say, oh, you can't touch this dish because this dish is too expensive. And you're only getting paid $4.50 an hour because it's under minimum wage, because you're supposed to get the tips, but that's another whole story. Other lawsuits, we'll worry about that later. So, but you only get paid $4.50 an hour. So we're not going to let you eat this dish that you're preparing because it's too expensive, or you're serving, it's too expensive. What would that mean? That would be against the spirit of the law. It may be consistent with the law, but it would be against the spirit of the law. Spirit of the law is, if you're dealing with something that is a divine blessing, God blessed you, and you have people working for you, they should be able to partake. Withholding them would be a problem, right? Sometimes you go to expensive wine. So here I'm serving a bottle of wine that's cost $1,000. So the employees will say, don't drink the wine. Don't let this server drink a little bit of wine. Each ounce of wine is worth, I'm not doing the math in my head right now, but each ounce of wine is worth more than this guy's labor all day, right? So that would be, the pouring the wine is a good question. Whether legally it wouldn't apply, because legally it's after the work is done. After the work is done, you have no obligation, right? It's only in the process. Once it's obligated in Meiser, which we discussed last week. So legally, there wouldn't be any problem with pouring the guy pouring wine. But the spirit of the law would mean include the people who are working and building, include them in the blessing. So that's what I would say. I would also say that I'm not an economist, but I remember when I was in yeshiva, this is going back. You brought up this question, and it brought me back how many years? This brought me back to the year when we were learning this in yeshiva. This was in the year 2000, 22 years ago. Oh my God. 22 years ago, we were sitting in yeshiva, and somebody said, it referenced an idea, which I have no idea if I have to Google it, but there's some economic theory that said as follows, that an employee working, I don't know when it was said, but employee working in the production line to create a car should be able to be paid enough money that they should be able to buy a car. Doesn't mean every day I come into the factory and I get a car, but it means, right, if I'm building, if I'm in the business, if I'm working in an assembly line, I'm working in the production of a product, and I have no ability ever to buy this product, then something is wrong in the relationship between labor and production. So there's an imbalance. There's something cruel here. Now, I'm not saying that. I'm not an economist. I'm not saying it has to be imposed by the government, but I'm just saying, that there is a problem when this happens. Right? If I'm in the business of production, I should be able to partake in this blessing somehow. Now, it doesn't mean if I'm in the business of building luxury yachts, I should be able to afford a luxury yacht. Maybe yeah, maybe no, I don't know. A jumbo jet, I don't know. But these are the types of questions that this concept raises, which is, I'm working in the produce. Do I get some of am I excluded from the blessing that I'm engaged in? That's the spirit of the law. The law itself, no. The law, remember, we have law and we have ethics, and it's not always the same. The law is very simple. I'm going to see, and you'll see in the Talmud, it's not so simple. Some people say you have to work, and if you're only working with your hands and not with your feet, it's not considered working, right? So the parameters of the law are very specific. What has to be done, what does not have to be done. But then there's the question, what is the broader message?
Thank you, Rabbi. I guess we will have to draw the line between something that's edible versus something that's not edible. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble economically.
And even edible, we'll see in a minute, it has to be, I think we read it last week, has to grow from the ground. If you're working and producing cheese is not directly from the ground. It comes from the animal, which eats from the ground, okay. But if you're in the meat production business, it has to be something directly grows from the ground. Why? I don't know. That's the example. The closest thing we got last week is that when it comes to the ground giving its produce, it's almost like a miracle. You see the divine, you see it's not your own strength. It's not my ingenuity. I did not create it by myself, right? I'm dependent on nature. So if you realize that the blessing comes from God, don't exclude somebody else while you yourself are obviously and clearly being bestowed upon the blessing from above, as opposed to other places where it's not so obvious. It's not so obvious that the blessing comes from God. So perhaps withholding the blessing from somebody else is not that big of a crime. But if it's obvious, the earth is giving it to you. It's not you didn't do this. It's the earth with the rain, right? This is divine blessing. Now, when you're a recipient of divine blessing, you are holding it back from somebody else. That's just too cruel for the Torah to be able to manage, to handle.
Thank you.
So again, there's a distinction between the law and the broader spirit of the law. The law is obligating. The spirit of the law is obligating based on your own judgment in your area how you can apply it. But it's not going to be that. But the law is not going to impose how and when to apply it. And that's given to you as an individual person to figure out how you want to apply that spirit of the law. I know in my house, if you come to my house on Friday to do what, doesn't matter what you're coming for. You're coming to help the garden. You're coming to the plumber, whatever you're going to be. You're not going to be able to leave the house without my wife giving you challah or whatever else that's cooking on the stove. That's just the way it works. That's nice. Not the law. It's the spirit of the law. You're coming in and there's excitement. You get some, even though you're not technically working in the field and the produce. Doesn't matter. If you come in, you're going to get something to eat.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rabbi. I think we will all benefit from studying Talmud, even instead of studying ethics.
In addition. Okay.
Thank you.
The question is, okay, we'll start with the Talmud. We'll see how far we get. I don't want to go all day, but we'll see both those points. Remember, the first thing we discussed, the first question we discussed is, what is the definition of labor? Is washing labor, or do you have to do it? And then Maimonides says, if you do it, one limb is enough. But it's not so simple. That's only the rabbis. Is an opinion that disagrees, and we have to now define a disagreement. So we have what to do. We're going to be kept busy for a little bit here. Don't worry if you thought that we're going to run out of things to argue about. Thank God we're not. Okay, says the Mishnah. Let's see if we can close this, make it a little easier to read. Okay, says the Mishnah. If a laborer was performing labor with his hands, but not with his feet, or with his feet, but not with his hands, for example, pressing grapes, or even if he was performing labor only with his shoulder, right? Let's say he's carrying something on his shoulder. This one may eat the produce of the field. Why? He's working. Who says working has to be with all hands and feet? I hired me to work. What did you hire? All my limbs? You hired me to my hand is enough. That is the Mishnah. That's what Maimonides says, and that's the first opinion in the Mishnah. They call it Tanakama, the first opinion that's unattributed. Usually the law follows this opinion that's unattributed, as opposed to the second guy, an individual person who disagrees, because we assume that the first unattributed opinion is the majority, and in general, we follow the majority. So let's see. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, a laborer may not eat unless he performs labor with his hands and with his feet. Okay, he says he wants more, quote unquote, pun intended, not just hands on, but you have to have the feet on as well. Okay, now we're going to look at the verses. That's funny is that each person is going to bring proof to his opinion. So let's go. The journey continues. My time of Gemara. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for the ruling of the rabbis stated in the first clause of the Mishnah, which is hands is enough. You don't have to work with your feet. The Gemara explains that the verse states when you come into your neighbor's vineyard. Since the Torah does not specify a particular kind of task, it is understood as referring to any labor he performed. In other words, the rabbis say, I'm sorry, you want to impose a requirement that you have to work with hands and feet? We see no such requirement in the verse. The verse says when you come into your friend's field, The verse doesn't tell us to do what. We understand it means to do work, but the Torah doesn't give a description of what type of the work is, and therefore the Torah is being vague, and therefore it means any type of physical labor, but it does not have to mean hands and feet. That's what the rabbis and Maimonides goes with this. This is logical for most people. Rabbi Yehuda, this is actually funny. He compares. It's funny. Okay, it's funny, but we'll read it. Why not? The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, says a laborer may not eat unless he performs labor with his hands and with his feet. Right? That we mentioned that. The Gemara asks, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda? Where do you get this from? Like you have to work with your feet. Where did he pick this up from? The Gemara explains this law is like that of a threshing ox. Just as one is not required to let an ox feed unless it is performing labor with its hands and with its feet, as it uses all four of its legs to thresh, so too a laborer is not entitled to eat unless he is performing labor with his hands and with his feet. This is a little funny. He's saying the employee is like the ox, but what he's referring to is as follows. There's another mitzvah in the Torah, not only to allow the human being to eat while he is working, but there's another law in the Torah, and that is you may not muzzle, cover the mouth of an ox while the ox is threshing. That's a biblical commandment, one of the 613 commandments, right? Your ox is threshing grain. You can't say, oh, wheat is too expensive. I'll give you other food later. I'll give you the junk food later. I'll give you corn later. No. Your ox is threshing the grain. You must let the ox eat from the grain. That's another mitzvah in the same parsha, same portion of the Torah. Says Rabbi Yossi, look, you have to compare the two. Just like the ox works with all four, why should the human being be better than the ox? So the human being also has to work with his hands and feet. Now, I don't know what he means. It means you have to walk to the tree with your feet. I don't know exactly what he means. Bottom line is, this is not accepted. What is accepted is the opinion of the majority of the rabbis. The rabbis say, sorry. The Torah says when you come to your friend's work, to your friend's yard, to your friend's orchard, come out to your friend's field, it doesn't say what you're coming to do. It doesn't even say you're coming to work. But we know that it means coming to work. We discussed that last week. But the bottom line is, maybe now I understand why the Torah doesn't say you're coming to work. Because then the Torah has to define what work is, and we don't want to. According to the sages, it's any physical work. If I'm going to say to come to walk and harvest, then you're going to say someone carrying is not included, right? So the Torah, perhaps, I don't know. Perhaps the Torah is intentionally vague to support the rabbi's opinion that it doesn't matter. As long as you're doing labor, it doesn't matter what form of labor. Okay, that's the easy piece. If you want easy, we'll stop here. But if you have another few minutes to get confused, this is fun. Oh my God, this is funny. How could I miss this? So we discussed a lot that we discussed this with the Maimonides years ago. We did a whole thing on Teyku. Teyku is literally, it's a question that is unresolved in the Talmud. And sometimes you ask a question that is so, I don't want to say hard, because some of them are actually technical and some of them are very seem trivial, like you'll see in this case, but they can't be answered. And we say Teyku. Teyku literally means let the question stand, unsolved. And Phil Maimon was kind enough to buy me a book in English that collects all of the Teykus in the entire Talmud. All the times the Talmud says, unresolved question, we don't know. The most famous one is the first page above Metzia, of Elo Metzias, which is the first piece of Talmud they study with kids. And that's about the scattered fruit, but we're not going to get into that. Here you have a funny case. Again, it's ridiculous. Why are we talking about this case? It's so strange, but no. The law is about finding the parameters. What is in, what is out. We need definitions. If there's no definitions, there's no law. If you say be kind to your workers, you don't define what that means. Sorry, that means then you end up with, socialism, communism, I don't know what. You have to have parameters of what the obligation is. So the journey continues. We ask a question, Boy Rabba, with regard to a similar issue, Rabba Bar Rav Huna raised a dilemma. This is actually funny. If one threshed with geese and chickens rather than four-legged animals, I need to thresh the grain, right? Threshing is to step on it. So the kernels are separated from the stalk. So I don't have any ox. So I put it in my front yard. I call all my geese and chickens and say, run around this place. By the time they finish running around, there's going to be, my kernels will be separated. And then the next step is to throw it up into the air. And what happens is the shaft gets blown away and the kernels land on the floor. How do I know about this? I never did this for a living, but these are part of the 39 prohibited labors on Shabbat. The process of making bread is 39 prohibited labors. So I know that there's a concept. After you thresh, you zoida, you throw it up into the air, and the shaft blows away. The kernels are heavier. They fall down in place. Okay, so now I have my geese and chickens running around. What's the problem? The problem is they're doing the work, but they're only doing the work with 2 feet. They don't have 4 feet. Could I muzzle them? I don't know. Good luck muzzling your geese. But muzzling doesn't just mean muzzling the mouth. It would mean, let's say, covering the grain so they can't eat it. And they're stepping on a plastic tarp or whatever it is. So now this is the big dilemma. In case you were wondering if you're allowed to muzzle the grain when your geese eat it, this is your piece of Talmud. If one threshed with geese and chickens rather than 4-legged animals, what is the halacha according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda? Right? The rabbis say no problem. You don't have to work with all 4 limbs. But Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, said no. You have to work with all 4 limbs, just like the animal does. But what happens if it's an animal that has no 4 limbs? It's a funny question, but we're trying to get to the core. What's the core? So here's the question. The Gemara clarifies the 2 sides of the dilemma. Do we require threshing with all its force, as it is for this reason that an ox must thresh with all 4 of its legs? And that condition is fulfilled here, as these birds perform labor with all their strength. Or perhaps we require that the animal must actually perform labor with its hands and with its feet, i.e. with all 4 legs, and this is not the case here. In other words, what do you mean? When the Talmud, when Rabbi Yossi, again, we don't know what the Torah says because the rabbis say the Torah is not saying this. But according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, according to the sage who says that the only time the Torah says you cannot muzzle the animal is when it's working with all 4 feet. What does 4 feet mean? Does 4 feet mean all your strength? And if so, chickens working with all their chicken or geese working with all their strength could not be muzzled? Or do you mean, no, you need 4 legs, and therefore the chickens could be muzzled? Very, very big question. I'm only half joking because philosophically there's a lot to think about here. So we'll get to that in a minute, hopefully, if I can figure out how to share this. For some reason, the computer is giving me trouble today. Here we go. There you go. There you are. What's the answer? It's a very big question. No answer was found. And the Gemara says that the lemma shall stand unresolved. Teyku, it should stand unresolved. When we were kids, they taught us in yeshiva that Teyku, let this thing stand, is also an acronym for Tishbi, Yitaretz, Kushias, and Ibayas. Elijah the prophet, in the Bible, he was called Eliyahu HaTishbi. Elijah will answer all questions, and Mashiach will come, will know the answer. So I have a little bit to say about this question, but if anybody else wants to share, I'm much more interested in listening than talking. So if you want to share about this question, about what this Teyku, this sounds like an unresolved question. What's the big question? When we say work with all 4 feet, do we mean 2 of your hands? Or do we mean all your strength and then the chicken is included? Or do we mean we need 4 limbs and therefore the chicken is not included? Okay, what's happening here? What is going on here? Okay, so let's hear what's going on. Vicky, go ahead, please.
Well, I think it's going back to the question that we discussed before. What's the moral lesson for this? So we don't want to be cruel to all living creatures, birds included. So it doesn't matter how many feet or legs they have. We just have to follow the moral standard.
So that's one side of the dilemma. The other side of the dilemma is, no, you have to stick to the law.
Right, but that's the reason that it's not even mentioned, so we can think about it and think about the moral reason behind it.
Right. I hear. Yeah. So that would be the 2 sides of the debate. I feel I didn't plan to say this honestly, but I feel just by reading this, I feel that when you come to Teyku, it's really you have to get to the philosophical question. What's at the core of this issue? I think I didn't develop this, so tell me if I'm wrong, but tell me if this resonates. What I think is that it's really a question of when we want to evaluate whether this guy, quote unquote, guy, chicken, ox, person, is entitled to eat. Are we looking at it from a subjective perspective, or are we looking at it from an objective perspective? What do I mean? The chicken and the geese is working with all its effort. Okay, but according to one side of the question, it doesn't matter that you're doing with all your. So one side of the question is, if you're working with all your effort, you're entitled to eat and not be and not be deprived from threshing, from eating while you thresh, not be muzzled. Why? Because I know you're not an ox, but you don't have 4 legs, but you're doing with your 2 full legs, and that's your full potential. That's one side of the question. The other side of the question, I would say, no, sorry, I know you're working hard, but you're not producing, obviously not producing as much as the ox, but objectively, there's only 2 hands here and not 4 hands here. So your cat would get to eat. So in other words, the way I see it is when you want to evaluate the end result, is this considered work? Is this considered labor that lives up to the definition of labor? There's 2 ways to look at it. You can look at it objectively. Is this production in line with what other people would produce? That's one way to look at it. And if yes, you're entitled to food because we can't thresh. But the other side to look at it is, no, it doesn't really matter if you're producing the way other people are producing. If you are giving it all your strength, it's not your fault that you were born a geese and you only have 2 legs. You're doing with all your strength. You have to look at the subjective investments. And therefore, when you want to evaluate the labor, you look at it from the perspective of the person working, not necessarily from the result being produced. And that is a question. That's a Teyku. That's a philosophical question. A lot of the Teykus boil down to a philosophical question, or not just philosophical, even some philosophical, some it gets even deeper than that, existential. But this would be, for me, this is a philosophical question. You want to evaluate what the person's doing. Do you evaluate the result, or do you evaluate the effort? And there's 2 ways to think. Child comes home, got to 60, 64 on a test. Are you happy? Are you sad? Well, if you're the person invested, you're very happy. Wow, you tried your hardest. On the other hand, you say, sorry, I can't hire you if this is your mark, because you objectively, you're not producing on par. So how to look at it? How to look at the question stands. Question stands means there's truth to both. That's what the question stand means. It's unresolved. There's 2 ways to look at it. You can evaluate based on objective parameters, and that would be legitimate. Logically, it's fine. And you can also evaluate based on the person's own effort, and that would also be the logical. And the question stands because both are good. So I'm actually very excited about this because I didn't think about this before. I just sort of stumbled onto this. God sent it to me, so thank you, God. And this was a lot of fun. So I appreciate it. Thank you for joining. Comments, questions, objections, anything else, I welcome, either on the record or off the record, any way you like. Wonderful.